Question 1. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a key client of Pirelli's wealth management division has expressed a strong preference for a particular high-risk, speculative investment product, citing its potential for rapid gains. The client's relationship manager, eager to maintain client satisfaction and secure a significant commission, is inclined to proceed with the investment as requested. However, initial internal reviews suggest this product may not be fully aligned with the client's stated long-term financial goals and risk tolerance, which are documented as moderate. What is the most appropriate course of action for the relationship manager and Pirelli? Option A. Inform the client that their requested investment is not suitable and immediately withdraw from managing their portfolio, citing regulatory concerns. Option B. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, prioritizing client satisfaction and the immediate financial benefit, and assume the client has fully understood the risks involved. Option C. Execute the investment as requested but include a disclaimer in the client agreement stating that Pirelli is not liable for any losses incurred due to the client's chosen investment. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment, documenting the client's understanding of the risks and benefits of the preferred product, and compare it against their stated financial objectives and risk tolerance. If the product remains unsuitable, engage in a detailed discussion with the client to explain the rationale and propose alternative suitable investments. Correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment, documenting the client's understanding of the risks and benefits of the preferred product, and compare it against their stated financial objectives and risk tolerance. If the product remains unsuitable, engage in a detailed discussion with the client to explain the rationale and propose alternative suitable investments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing competing stakeholder interests while adhering to the strict regulatory framework governing financial advice in the UK, as defined by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and relevant CISI, Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, guidelines. The core tension lies between a client's stated desire for a specific investment product and the advisor's professional obligation to ensure that product is suitable and in the client's best interest, considering their individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and financial objectives. Misinterpreting or disregarding stakeholder feedback without proper due diligence can lead to regulatory breaches, client dissatisfaction, and reputational damage for both the advisor and Pirelli. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented assessment of the client's needs and the suitability of the proposed investment. This means actively listening to stakeholder feedback, but critically evaluating it against regulatory requirements. The advisor must confirm the client's understanding of the investment's risks and benefits, ensuring it aligns with their stated objectives and risk appetite. This aligns with FCA principles for businesses, PRIN, and specific conduct of business rules, COBs, which mandate acting honestly, fairly, and professionally in accordance with the best interests of clients. CISI professional ethics also emphasize client welfare and competence. An incorrect approach would be to immediately proceed with the client's requested investment without independent verification of suitability. This fails to meet the FCA's best interest requirement and the Know Your Client (KIC) principles. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the stakeholder feedback entirely without attempting to understand the underlying reasons for the client's preference. This demonstrates a lack of client engagement and could lead to a missed opportunity to educate the client or identify a genuine, albeit perhaps poorly articulated, need. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed and client satisfaction over regulatory compliance by simply fulfilling the request without due diligence exposes both the advisor and Pirelli to significant regulatory risk and potential client harm. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's stated needs and feedback. This is followed by a rigorous assessment of the proposed solution against regulatory requirements and the client's verified circumstances. Documentation of this process is crucial for demonstrating compliance and professional judgment. If there is a discrepancy between the client's request and what is deemed suitable, the professional must engage in a transparent dialogue with the client, explaining the rationale and exploring alternative suitable options. Question 2. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some Pirelli financial advisors are prioritizing client requests for specific investment products over a comprehensive suitability assessment, potentially leading to recommendations that may not be in the client's best interest. Considering the regulatory framework for financial advice in the UK, which of the following approaches best addresses this feedback while ensuring compliance with FCA and CISI guidelines? Option A. Conduct a thorough fact-find to understand the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance, and then recommend the most suitable investment product based on this assessment, clearly explaining the rationale and addressing any deviations from the client's initial request. Option B. Focus on explaining the features of the client's requested product in detail, without conducting a full suitability assessment, to ensure the client feels heard and informed about their chosen investment. Option C. Politely decline the client's specific product request and steer them towards a pre-approved list of Pirelli's most profitable investment products. Option D. Immediately proceed with recommending the investment product the client has specifically requested, assuming the client has done their own research and knows what they want. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough fact-find to understand the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance, and then recommend the most suitable investment product based on this assessment, clearly explaining the rationale and addressing any deviations from the client's initial request. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing competing stakeholder interests while adhering to the stringent regulatory framework governing financial advice in the UK, as defined by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, and relevant CISI, Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, guidelines. The core tension lies between a client's stated preference for a particular investment product and the advisor's duty to ensure that the recommendation is suitable and in the client's best interest, considering all relevant factors. Misjudging this balance can lead to regulatory breaches, client dissatisfaction, and reputational damage for both the individual advisor and Pirelli. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of investments, followed by a recommendation that is demonstrably suitable and aligned with these factors, even if it deviates from the client's initial expressed preference. This aligns with the FCA's principles for businesses, particularly Principle 6, Customers' Interests, and Principle 9, Utmost Good Faith, and the CISI Code of Conduct, which emphasizes acting with integrity and in the best interests of clients. The advisor must be able to clearly articulate the rationale behind the recommendation, explaining why it is suitable and addressing any potential concerns the client might have about alternative options. An incorrect approach that prioritizes the client's initial request without a comprehensive suitability assessment fails to uphold the duty of care and the obligation to act in the client's best interest. This could lead to a recommendation that is not appropriate for the client's circumstances, potentially exposing them to undue risk or failing to meet their financial goals, thereby breaching FCA and CISI regulations. Another incorrect approach, that of immediately dismissing the client's request without understanding the underlying reasons for their preference, demonstrates a lack of client engagement and could be perceived as patronizing or dismissive. The advisor has a duty to guide the client. Ignoring their input entirely without exploration is unprofessional and may lead to a breakdown in trust. A further incorrect approach, that of recommending a product solely because it is familiar or easy to explain, without a rigorous suitability analysis, also falls short. The advisor's responsibility is to find the most suitable product for the client, not the most convenient for the advisor. This could result in a misaligned recommendation and a failure to meet regulatory expectations. The professional reasoning process in such situations should involve 1. Active listening and probing to fully understand the client's stated preference and the reasons behind it. 2. Conducting a comprehensive fact-find to gather all necessary information about the client's financial situation, objectives, risk appetite, and knowledge. 3. Analyzing this information to identify suitable investment options that meet the client's needs and risk profile. 4. Presenting a clear, reasoned recommendation, explaining its suitability and addressing any potential alternatives, including why the client's initial preference might not be the most appropriate. 5. Documenting the entire process thoroughly to demonstrate compliance and good practice. Question 3. Investigation of Pirelli's proposed expansion into a new international market, where it intends to list and trade its securities, raises questions about the most appropriate regulatory compliance strategy. Given the potential for differing financial regulations and disclosure requirements, what is the most prudent approach for Pirelli to ensure adherence to the new market's laws and guidelines? Option A. Proactively engage with the relevant regulatory authorities in the target market to understand and comply with all specific listing and trading requirements, seeking pre-clearance or formal guidance where necessary. Option B. Proceed with the listing and trading of securities in the new market and address any regulatory inquiries or issues that may arise after the expansion has been completed. Option C. Assume that the regulatory framework for listing and trading securities in Pirelli's home jurisdiction is sufficiently similar to the new market's requirements and proceed with minimal adaptation. Option D. Rely solely on the advice of Pirelli's internal legal department to interpret and apply the new market's regulations, without seeking external specialized expertise or direct regulatory engagement. The correct answer is A. Proactively engage with the relevant regulatory authorities in the target market to understand and comply with all specific listing and trading requirements, seeking pre-clearance or formal guidance where necessary. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire to expand its market presence and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Pirelli, as a publicly listed company, must navigate these complexities with utmost diligence. The challenge lies in balancing commercial objectives with legal and ethical obligations, ensuring that all actions taken are compliant and uphold the trust placed in the company by regulators and the public. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate potential risks associated with new market entry, particularly concerning the disclosure of material information and adherence to local financial regulations. The correct approach involves a thorough and proactive engagement with the relevant regulatory bodies in the target market. This means seeking pre-clearance or formal guidance on the specific requirements for listing and trading Pirelli securities. This proactive stance demonstrates a commitment to compliance and allows for the identification and resolution of any potential regulatory hurdles before significant resources are committed. It ensures that Pirelli's expansion strategy is built on a foundation of legal certainty, minimizing the risk of future sanctions, reputational damage, or disruption to its business operations. This aligns with the fundamental principles of regulatory compliance, which emphasize transparency, fairness, and the protection of market participants. An incorrect approach would be to assume that existing listing and trading practices in Pirelli's home jurisdiction are directly transferable to the new market without verification. This overlooks the possibility of significant differences in regulatory frameworks, disclosure obligations, and investor protection mechanisms. Such an assumption could lead to inadvertent breaches of local laws, potentially resulting in fines, suspension of trading, or even criminal charges. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with the expansion based solely on advice from internal legal counsel, without seeking external validation or direct engagement with the target market's regulators. While internal counsel is valuable, they may not possess the nuanced, up-to-the-minute understanding of a foreign jurisdiction's specific regulatory landscape and enforcement priorities. This could lead to a misinterpretation of requirements or an underestimation of compliance risks. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory due diligence. This involves 1. Identifying all relevant jurisdictions and their respective regulatory bodies. 2. Conducting comprehensive research into the specific listing and trading requirements of each target market. 3. Seeking formal legal and regulatory advice from experts qualified in those jurisdictions. 4. Engaging in proactive communication with regulatory authorities to clarify any ambiguities and obtain necessary approvals. 5. Implementing robust internal controls and compliance procedures to ensure ongoing adherence to all applicable regulations. This systematic approach ensures that business objectives are pursued within a compliant and ethical framework. Question 4. Stakeholder feedback indicates that recent market speculation regarding Pirelli's supply chain resilience is causing significant concern among investors. As a compliance officer, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action to address this feedback while adhering to regulatory requirements for public companies? Option A. Advise the investor relations team to privately reassure key institutional investors that the speculation is unfounded without making a public statement. Option B. Immediately issue a public statement addressing the speculation with the latest available internal data, emphasizing Pirelli's proactive measures. Option C. Initiate an internal review to verify the accuracy and completeness of the information related to supply chain resilience. Consult with relevant departments and prepare a comprehensive, compliant disclosure if deemed necessary. Option D. Instruct the communications department to draft a brief holding statement acknowledging the feedback, but deferring any substantive response until further internal investigation is complete. The correct answer is B. Immediately issue a public statement addressing the speculation with the latest available internal data, emphasizing Pirelli's proactive measures. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for timely and accurate information dissemination with the regulatory obligations of Pirelli to ensure all public statements are fair, balanced, and not misleading. The pressure to respond quickly to market sentiment, as indicated by stakeholder feedback, can lead to hasty decisions that might overlook crucial compliance steps. Careful judgment is required to navigate this tension, ensuring that any communication adheres strictly to the regulatory framework governing listed companies. The correct approach involves a structured and compliant process for addressing stakeholder feedback. This means acknowledging the feedback internally, conducting a thorough review of the information and its potential market impact, and then formulating a response that is factual, balanced, and compliant with all relevant disclosure rules. This approach is correct because it prioritizes regulatory adherence and investor protection, ensuring that Pirelli's communications are not only responsive, but also legally sound and ethically responsible. It aligns with the principles of market integrity and transparency expected of publicly traded entities. An incorrect approach that involves immediate, unvetted public disclosure of preliminary findings or speculative information would fail to meet regulatory standards. Such an approach risks disseminating incomplete or inaccurate data, which could mislead investors and create market volatility, leading to potential breaches of disclosure obligations. Another incorrect approach, such as ignoring the feedback entirely or delaying a response indefinitely, would also be professionally unacceptable. This would demonstrate a lack of responsiveness to stakeholders and could be interpreted as a failure to address material concerns, potentially violating principles of good corporate governance and market fairness. A third incorrect approach, which might involve selectively disclosing information to favored stakeholders, would be a clear breach of equal treatment and market manipulation regulations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the nature and potential impact of the stakeholder feedback. This should be followed by an assessment of relevant regulatory requirements and internal policies. The next step involves gathering all necessary information and conducting a thorough analysis to ensure accuracy and completeness. Finally, any communication or action taken should be reviewed for compliance and potential market impact before dissemination. This structured process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with both regulatory obligations and ethical standards. Question 5. The performance metrics show a significant increase in potential client acquisition for Pirelli's new service offering, but the onboarding process for these clients is encountering delays due to perceived ambiguities in the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) guidelines regarding digital identity verification. The sales team is pushing for a faster, less stringent onboarding to meet targets, while the compliance team is concerned about potential breaches of the FCA's client due diligence requirements. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for Pirelli in this situation? Option A. Immediately implement a revised onboarding process that streamlines digital identity verification by accepting a broader range of documents, assuming this will satisfy the spirit of the FCA regulations. Option B. Develop an internal policy that allows for discretionary exceptions to the standard onboarding procedures for high-value clients, based on the sales team's assessment of risk. Option C. Halt all new client onboarding for the service until a definitive, regulator-approved interpretation of the digital identity verification guidelines is obtained, even if it means missing performance targets. Option D. Proactively engage with the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA) to seek clarification on the specific digital identity verification requirements and propose a compliant onboarding process based on their guidance. The correct answer is A. Immediately implement a revised onboarding process that streamlines digital identity verification by accepting a broader range of documents, assuming this will satisfy the spirit of the FCA regulations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for rapid business development with adherence to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The pressure to achieve ambitious performance targets can tempt individuals to overlook or rationalize minor deviations from established procedures, potentially leading to significant compliance breaches. Careful judgment is required to ensure that short-term gains do not compromise long-term integrity and legal standing. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent engagement with the relevant regulatory body, seeking clarification and guidance on the interpretation and application of the rules to the specific situation. This demonstrates a commitment to compliance and a willingness to operate within the established legal framework. Specifically, consulting with the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, for guidance on client onboarding procedures and data handling under the UK's regulatory regime is the appropriate step. This aligns with the FCA's principles of treating customers fairly and maintaining market integrity, ensuring that Pirelli's operations are conducted in a manner that protects investors and upholds confidence in the financial markets. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the new onboarding process without seeking clarification, assuming a lenient interpretation of the regulations. This carries a significant risk of noncompliance, as the FCA's rules are designed to be prescriptive, and deviations without explicit approval can lead to enforcement actions, fines, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to implement a workaround that technically avoids direct contravention of a specific rule, but undermines the spirit and intent of the regulation. This could be seen as a deliberate attempt to circumvent regulatory oversight and would likely be viewed unfavorably by the regulator. Finally, delaying the implementation of the new process indefinitely due to fear of noncompliance, without actively seeking guidance, would hinder business objectives and could also be seen as a failure to manage regulatory risk effectively. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding and adhering to regulatory requirements. This involves 1. Identifying potential regulatory implications of business decisions. 2. Proactively seeking clarification from relevant regulatory bodies when ambiguity exists. 3. Documenting all consultations and decisions made. 4. Implementing processes that embed compliance into daily operations. 5. Regularly reviewing and updating procedures to reflect changes in regulations and best practices. Question 6. When evaluating the communication strategy for a significant, unannounced product development breakthrough at Pirelli that is expected to materially impact its stock price, which approach best ensures compliance with UK financial regulations and SISI professional conduct guidelines? Option A. Defer public disclosure of the breakthrough indefinitely, citing ongoing internal discussions about its full market implications, while continuing to trade Pirelli securities. Option B. Immediately disseminate the information to a select group of key financial analysts and institutional investors to gauge market reaction before a broader public announcement. Option C. Prepare a comprehensive press release and simultaneously distribute it to all major financial news outlets and the London Stock Exchange's regulatory news service, ensuring all market participants receive the information at the same time. Option D. Share preliminary details of the breakthrough through informal channels, such as private emails and phone calls, to trusted contacts within the financial community. The correct answer is B. Immediately disseminate the information to a select group of key financial analysts and institutional investors to gauge market reaction before a broader public announcement. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Pirelli, as a publicly listed company, must adhere to stringent regulatory requirements concerning financial reporting and disclosure. The challenge lies in balancing the need for timely and accurate information dissemination with the potential for market manipulation or insider trading. Professionals must exercise sound judgment to ensure compliance with the relevant regulatory framework, which in this context is assumed to be the UK's regulatory framework and the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA rules, as well as SISI, Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, guidelines for professional conduct. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent communication strategy that prioritizes the dissemination of material information to all market participants simultaneously. This aligns with the principle of market integrity, ensuring a level playing field for investors. Specifically, it requires immediate disclosure of any information that, if made public, will be likely to have a significant effect on the price of Pirelli securities. This is a core tenet of market abuse regulations, such as the UK's Market Abuse Regulation, MAR, which aims to prevent insider dealing and unlawful disclosure of inside information. Adhering to this approach demonstrates a commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical business practices, fostering investor confidence. An incorrect approach that involves selectively disclosing information to a select group of analysts or investors before a public announcement is fundamentally flawed. This constitutes unlawful disclosure of inside information, a direct violation of MAR. It creates an unfair advantage for those receiving the information early, potentially leading to insider trading and market manipulation. Such an action undermines market integrity and can result in severe regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and legal consequences for both the individuals involved and Pirelli. Another incorrect approach, delaying the disclosure of material information without a legitimate reason, also poses significant risks. MAR allows for the deferral of disclosure of inside information under specific, strictly defined circumstances, e.g., to protect Pirelli's legitimate interests, provided that non-disclosure does not mislead the public and the information remains confidential. Any unjustified delay is a breach. This can be interpreted as an attempt to manipulate market sentiment or to gain an unfair advantage, leading to regulatory scrutiny and potential sanctions. A third incorrect approach, relying solely on informal communication channels for material updates, is unprofessional and non-compliant. Regulatory frameworks mandate formal, verifiable disclosure mechanisms for material information. Informal channels lack the necessary transparency and audit trail, making it impossible to ensure that all market participants receive the information simultaneously and accurately. This can lead to confusion, misinformation, and accusations of selective disclosure or market manipulation. Professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of the company's disclosure obligations under the applicable regulatory framework. When potentially material information arises, the immediate step should be to assess its nature and potential impact on Pirelli's share price. If it is deemed material, the default action should be immediate public disclosure through approved channels. If deferral is considered, it must be done with extreme caution, ensuring all conditions for deferral are met and documented, and with the explicit understanding that the information must be disclosed as soon as the conditions for deferral are no longer met. Consultation with legal and compliance departments is paramount throughout this process. Question 7. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a significant institutional investor has approached Pirelli's investor relations team with specific questions regarding recent market rumors about a potential new product launch. The investor is seeking confirmation or denial of these rumors, citing their importance for their investment decision. What is the most appropriate course of action for Pirelli's investor relations team in this situation? Option A. Acknowledge the investor's inquiry internally. Immediately consult with Pirelli's legal and compliance departments to assess the materiality of the rumors and determine the appropriate disclosure protocol before responding. Option B. Provide a direct, on-the-record confirmation or denial to the institutional investor based on the information available internally. Option C. Share the internal assessment of the rumors with the institutional investor and explain why they are considered inaccurate or speculative, without making a formal public statement. Option D. Inform the institutional investor that Pirelli does not comment on market rumors and advise them to rely solely on official company announcements. The correct answer is B. Provide a direct, on-the-record confirmation or denial to the institutional investor based on the information available internally. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for timely and accurate information dissemination with the regulatory obligations of Pirelli to ensure that all material information is disclosed in a fair and non-selective manner. The pressure to respond quickly to market speculation, especially from key stakeholders like institutional investors, can lead to hasty decisions that might inadvertently breach disclosure rules. Careful judgment is required to determine what constitutes material information and how it should be communicated to avoid market abuse or insider dealing. The correct approach involves a structured and compliant communication strategy. This means acknowledging the stakeholder feedback internally, assessing the validity and materiality of the information being discussed, and then determining the appropriate disclosure mechanism. This typically involves consulting with the legal and compliance departments to ensure any public statement adheres to the principles of timely, accurate, and equal disclosure, as mandated by relevant securities regulations. The justification for this approach lies in upholding market integrity and investor confidence, preventing selective disclosure which can disadvantage other market participants and lead to regulatory sanctions. An incorrect approach would be to provide a direct, off-the-cuff response to the institutional investor without proper internal review. This risks disclosing material non-public information prematurely or selectively, violating regulations that prohibit such practices. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the feedback entirely, which could damage stakeholder relationships and potentially lead to the market acting on incomplete or inaccurate information, creating further volatility. Finally, a response that is misleading or evasive, even if not directly disclosing non-public information, can also be problematic as it fails to provide clarity and may be interpreted as an attempt to manipulate market perception. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Recognizing the potential regulatory implications of any communication. 2. Escalating the issue to the appropriate internal departments, legal, compliance, investor relations. 3. Conducting a thorough assessment of the information's materiality and the best method for disclosure. 4. Ensuring all communications are consistent, accurate, and disseminated to the market broadly and simultaneously where required. Question 8. Analysis of the implementation challenges Pirelli faces when a potential major client insists on rapid contract finalization for a new service that involves collecting and processing significant amounts of customer data, with the client providing only general assurances about their data handling practices. Option A. Proceed with contract finalization immediately, relying on the client's assurances and addressing any potential regulatory issues after the deal is closed. Option B. Accept the contract with a clause stating that Pirelli is not responsible for any data privacy violations by the client, shifting all liability to the client. Option C. Delay contract finalization until a comprehensive regulatory compliance review, including data privacy, impact assessments, and verification of the client's data handling procedures against relevant data protection laws, is completed. Option D. Negotiate a simplified data collection process for the initial phase of the contract, deferring the full regulatory review to a later stage once the service is operational. The correct answer is A. Proceed with contract finalization immediately, relying on the client's assurances and addressing any potential regulatory issues after the deal is closed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a Pirelli employee due to the inherent conflict between commercial objectives and regulatory compliance. The pressure to secure a significant contract can lead to overlooking or downplaying potential regulatory breaches, requiring careful judgment to balance business needs with legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach involves prioritizing a thorough review of all applicable regulations, including those related to data privacy and consumer protection, before committing to the contract. This proactive stance ensures that Pirelli operates within legal boundaries, mitigating risks of fines, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. Specifically, adhering to the principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, and obtaining explicit consent for data processing, as mandated by relevant data protection laws, is paramount. This aligns with the ethical duty to protect customer information and maintain transparency. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the contract without a comprehensive regulatory assessment, assuming that any issues can be addressed post-agreement. This demonstrates a disregard for due diligence and regulatory foresight, potentially leading to significant legal repercussions. Such an approach violates the principle of lawful processing of personal data and could result in breaches of data protection legislation, leading to substantial penalties and reputational harm. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the client's assurances regarding their compliance, without independent verification. This abdicates responsibility for Pirelli's own regulatory obligations and exposes the company to risks if the client's assurances are inaccurate or incomplete. This failure to conduct adequate due diligence is a breach of professional responsibility and could lead to complicity in regulatory violations. A further incorrect approach is to attempt to circumvent or interpret regulations in a manner that favors the immediate commercial gain, without a genuine commitment to compliance. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a willingness to engage in potentially unethical or illegal practices. Such a mindset undermines the trust placed in professionals to uphold regulatory standards and protect the company's long-term interests. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant regulatory obligations. This should be followed by a risk assessment to understand the potential consequences of non-compliance. Subsequently, a strategy for ensuring compliance should be developed and implemented, involving consultation with legal and compliance experts where necessary. Finally, ongoing monitoring and review are essential to maintain adherence to evolving regulations. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates that a key client of Pirelli is expressing frustration with the time taken to complete the necessary customer due diligence (CDD) and anti-money laundering (AML) checks for a new high-value contract, and is requesting expedited processing to meet their own aggressive launch timeline. Option A. Immediately expedite the CDD/AML checks for this client, overriding standard procedures to meet their requested timeline, and document the decision as a business necessity. Option B. Inform the client that the CDD/AML checks are mandatory and non-negotiable, and that they must wait for the standard process to be completed without any further discussion or explanation. Option C. Proactively communicate with the client, explaining the regulatory requirements for CDD/AML checks, the standard process, and the reasons for its importance in preventing financial crime, while providing an updated, realistic timeline for completion. Option D. Suggest to the client that Pirelli can proceed with a partial onboarding and begin some contractual obligations, while the full CDD/AML checks are pending, to demonstrate goodwill. The correct answer is C. Proactively communicate with the client, explaining the regulatory requirements for CDD/AML checks, the standard process, and the reasons for its importance in preventing financial crime, while providing an updated, realistic timeline for completion. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's perceived urgency and the regulatory requirements for thorough due diligence. Pirelli, as a regulated entity, must balance client relationships with its obligation to comply with all applicable laws and guidelines. The challenge lies in identifying and mitigating risks without unduly delaying legitimate business processes, which requires a nuanced understanding of regulatory boundaries and ethical responsibilities. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent communication strategy that educates stakeholders about the regulatory framework and its implications. This approach prioritizes adherence to the law while managing expectations and fostering understanding. Specifically, it involves clearly articulating the regulatory requirements for customer due diligence (CDD) and anti-money laundering (AML) checks, explaining the rationale behind these procedures, and outlining the expected timelines. This aligns with the principles of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, ensuring that Pirelli operates within legal boundaries and maintains its integrity. An incorrect approach that prioritizes client satisfaction over regulatory compliance would be to bypass or expedite the CDD/AML checks without proper justification or documentation. This would expose Pirelli to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and potential involvement in financial crime. Another incorrect approach, which is to simply refuse to engage with the client without offering any explanation or alternative, demonstrates a lack of professionalism and client management skills, potentially alienating legitimate business partners and failing to uphold the company's reputation for service. Finally, an approach that attempts to find loopholes or shortcuts in the regulatory process, even with the intention of speeding things up, is inherently risky and could lead to unintentional noncompliance. Professionals should approach such situations by first understanding the specific regulatory obligations relevant to Pirelli's operations. This involves consulting internal compliance policies, relevant legislation, e.g., Proceeds of Crime Act 2002, Money Laundering Regulations 2017 in the UK, or equivalent if a different jurisdiction were specified, and guidance from regulatory bodies. The next step is to assess the stakeholders' request against these requirements, identifying any potential conflicts or areas of concern. Communication is key. Professionals should aim to educate stakeholders about the necessity of the procedures, explain the process, and provide realistic timelines. If delays are unavoidable, offering alternative solutions or demonstrating progress where possible can help manage expectations. The ultimate goal is to achieve compliance while maintaining positive business relationships. Question 10. Quality control measures reveal a potential manufacturing defect in a batch of Pirelli tires that could compromise vehicle stability under specific driving conditions. The internal assessment suggests the defect is minor and affects a small percentage of the manufactured units. However, there is a risk of a serious accident if the defect manifests in a critical situation. What is the most appropriate course of action for Pirelli, considering its regulatory obligations and commitment to consumer safety? Option A. Conduct a more extensive, prolonged internal investigation to gather irrefutable proof of the defect's severity before any external communication, while continuing to sell the remaining tires from the batch. Option B. Instruct the sales and distribution teams to discreetly halt shipments of the affected tire batch and focus on addressing the defect through warranty claims and customer service without public disclosure or formal regulatory notification. Option C. Inform key stakeholders about the potential defect and its financial implications, and then proceed with a limited, targeted communication to affected customers only if they report issues, without involving regulatory bodies. Option D. Immediately initiate a voluntary recall of the affected tire batch and notify the relevant automotive safety regulatory authorities with a comprehensive report on the defect and the proposed corrective actions. The correct answer is D. Immediately initiate a voluntary recall of the affected tire batch and notify the relevant automotive safety regulatory authorities with a comprehensive report on the defect and the proposed corrective actions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need to address a potential product defect with the regulatory obligation to report such issues accurately and in a timely manner. Pressure to contain negative publicity and financial impact must not override the fundamental duty to comply with reporting requirements. Careful judgment is essential to ensure that any actions taken are both commercially responsible and legally sound. The correct approach involves a thorough internal investigation to ascertain the nature and extent of the defect, followed by prompt and accurate reporting to the relevant regulatory bodies as mandated by law. This demonstrates a commitment to consumer safety and regulatory compliance, which are paramount in the automotive industry. Specifically, adhering to the reporting timelines and disclosure requirements set forth by the relevant automotive safety regulations, e.g., those overseen by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, in the U.S., or equivalent bodies in other jurisdictions, is critical. This proactive and transparent approach minimizes potential harm to consumers and avoids severe penalties for noncompliance. An incorrect approach that prioritizes minimizing immediate financial impact by delaying or downplaying the reporting of a potential defect is ethically and regulatorily unsound. Such an action could lead to continued sale of defective products, endangering consumers and resulting in significant legal repercussions, including substantial fines, product recalls, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, which involves attempting to rectify the defect through informal customer service channels without proper regulatory notification, fails to meet the legal obligations for reporting safety-related issues. This bypasses the established framework for consumer protection and can be interpreted as an attempt to conceal a problem, leading to severe regulatory sanctions. Finally, an approach that focuses solely on internal fixes without considering the broader implications for consumer safety and regulatory disclosure neglects the core responsibilities of a manufacturer. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and consumer safety above all else. This involves understanding the specific reporting obligations under applicable laws, establishing clear internal protocols for identifying and escalating potential defects, and fostering a culture of transparency and accountability. When faced with a potential issue, the immediate steps should be to gather all relevant facts, assess the potential risks, and consult with legal and compliance departments to ensure all reporting requirements are met within the stipulated timeframes. Question 11. Research into Pirelli's strategic expansion into a new, highly regulated international market has revealed a potential need for significant new disclosures to the relevant financial market regulator. The internal legal team has advised that, while the expansion is strategically vital, the precise timing and scope of required disclosures are complex and could potentially impact the company's stock valuation if released prematurely. What is the most appropriate course of action for Pirelli's compliance department to ensure adherence to regulatory obligations while managing the commercial implications? Option A. Proceed with the market expansion as planned and address disclosure obligations only if directly queried by the regulator, citing the need to protect commercial interests. Option B. Disclose only the most basic, legally mandated information to the regulator, assuming that detailed strategic information is not immediately required. Option C. Rely solely on the internal legal team's interpretation of disclosure requirements and proceed without seeking external regulatory guidance. Option D. Proactively engage with the relevant financial market regulator to seek clarification on disclosure requirements and prepare for timely, accurate reporting. Correct answer is D. Proactively engage with the relevant financial market regulator to seek clarification on disclosure requirements and prepare for timely, accurate reporting. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid market expansion and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Pirelli, as a publicly listed entity, must navigate these complexities while upholding its legal and ethical obligations. The challenge lies in balancing commercial objectives with compliance, ensuring that growth strategies do not inadvertently lead to regulatory breaches or ethical compromises. Careful judgment is required to identify potential risks and implement appropriate controls. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with the relevant regulatory bodies, such as the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA in the UK, to understand and comply with all disclosure requirements for significant new market entries. This includes timely and accurate reporting of material information that could affect the company's share price or investor decisions. This approach is justified by the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000 FSMA and the FCA's listing rules, which mandate transparency and prohibit market abuse. Adhering to these regulations ensures fair treatment of all investors and maintains market confidence in Pirelli. An incorrect approach would be to delay or omit the necessary regulatory filings, hoping to gain a competitive advantage by not revealing strategic moves prematurely. This failure would contravene the FCA's disclosure guidance and transparency rules, which require issuers to disclose inside information as soon as possible. Another incorrect approach would be to provide incomplete or misleading information to regulators, which would be a direct violation of the FSMA and could lead to severe penalties, including fines and reputational damage. A third incorrect approach would be to rely solely on internal legal counsel without seeking external expertise or direct clarification from the FCA, potentially misinterpreting complex regulatory nuances. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves a thorough understanding of applicable laws and regulations, a proactive approach to seeking clarification from regulatory bodies when in doubt, and the establishment of robust internal controls and reporting mechanisms. When faced with strategic decisions that have regulatory implications, professionals should conduct a comprehensive risk assessment, consult with legal and compliance experts, and ensure that all actions are fully documented and justifiable under the relevant regulatory framework. Question 12. Risk assessment procedures indicate that Pirelli's proposed expansion into a new emerging market carries significant operational and compliance risks. Given the aggressive timeline for market entry, which approach best balances the need for rapid execution with robust risk management? Option A. Delegate the entire risk assessment process to the local market entry team, trusting their on-the-ground knowledge to identify and manage all relevant risks without central oversight. Option B. Proceed with the market entry based on a preliminary assessment of operational risks, deferring detailed compliance and financial risk analysis until after the initial launch to expedite the process. Option C. Rely primarily on historical data from similar past expansions to gauge potential risks, assuming that current conditions will not significantly deviate from previous experiences. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive, multifaceted risk assessment that integrates potential operational, financial, and compliance risks into the strategic planning and decision-making process for the expansion, ensuring mitigation strategies are developed and approved before significant capital is deployed. The correct answer is D. Conduct a comprehensive, multifaceted risk assessment that integrates potential operational, financial, and compliance risks into the strategic planning and decision-making process for the expansion, ensuring mitigation strategies are developed and approved before significant capital is deployed. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's strategic objectives with the imperative to maintain robust internal controls and adhere to regulatory expectations regarding risk management. The pressure to achieve ambitious growth targets can inadvertently lead to a relaxation of risk assessment standards if not managed carefully. Professionals must exercise sound judgment to ensure that the pursuit of business opportunities does not compromise the integrity of the risk framework or expose Pirelli to unacceptable levels of risk. The correct approach involves a proactive and integrated risk assessment process that is embedded within the strategic planning cycle. This means that potential risks associated with new market entries or product launches are identified, analyzed, and mitigated before significant resources are committed. This aligns with regulatory expectations that firms should have a comprehensive understanding of their risk landscape and implement controls to manage it effectively. For Pirelli, this would involve detailed due diligence, scenario planning, and the establishment of clear risk appetite statements that guide decision-making. Adherence to these principles ensures that growth is sustainable and that the company operates within its risk tolerance, thereby safeguarding its reputation and financial stability. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate financial gains over thorough risk assessment would be professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for regulatory requirements that mandate a systematic and ongoing evaluation of risks. Such an approach could lead to unforeseen losses, regulatory sanctions, and reputational damage, as it suggests a lack of due diligence and a potential for operating outside of established risk parameters. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on historical data without considering emerging risks would also be flawed. While historical data is valuable, it may not adequately capture the nuances of new markets or evolving competitive landscapes. Regulations often require forward-looking risk assessments that anticipate future threats and opportunities. Relying only on past performance can lead to a false sense of security and leave Pirelli vulnerable to novel risks. A third incorrect approach that delegates risk assessment entirely to operational teams without senior management oversight would be problematic. While operational teams have valuable insights, ultimate accountability for risk management rests with senior leadership. A lack of oversight can result in inconsistent application of risk assessment methodologies and a failure to align risk management with the company's overall strategic direction and risk appetite. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the strategic objective and its associated risks. 2. Consult relevant internal policies and external regulatory guidance. 3. Engage cross-functional teams to ensure a comprehensive view of risks. 4. Prioritize risk mitigation strategies based on impact and likelihood. 5. Obtain senior management approval and ensure clear communication of risk appetite. 6. Continuously monitor and review the effectiveness of risk management controls. Question 13. Comparative studies suggest that implementing new marketing technologies can introduce significant data protection challenges. For Pirelli's upcoming global digital marketing campaign, which aims to leverage advanced customer analytics, what is the most appropriate initial step to ensure compliance with the UK's data protection framework and SISI guidelines? Option A. Rely on the marketing team's understanding of data privacy to guide the campaign's implementation. Option B. Implement the campaign and address any data privacy concerns that arise during its operation. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive data protection impact assessment, DPIA, to identify and mitigate potential risks to individual privacy before the campaign's launch. Option D. Proceed with the campaign using existing data handling protocols, assuming they are adequate for new technologies. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive data protection impact assessment, DPIA, to identify and mitigate potential risks to individual privacy before the campaign's launch. Explanation: This scenario presents a professional challenge because Pirelli, as a global entity, must navigate varying regulatory landscapes while maintaining consistent ethical standards. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for localized operational efficiency with overarching compliance obligations, particularly when dealing with sensitive client data. A robust approach requires a deep understanding of the applicable regulatory framework, which for this exam is assumed to be the UK Regulatory Framework and SISI guidelines. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive data protection impact assessment (DPIA), conducted in accordance with the UK's Data Protection Act 2018, DPA 2018, and the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. As incorporated into UK law, this assessment would systematically identify and mitigate risks associated with processing personal data, ensuring that Pirelli's new marketing initiative respects individual privacy rights and complies with legal requirements for data processing, consent, and security. This aligns with the principles of data protection by design and by default, mandated by Article 25 of the GDPR, and the broader accountability principle under Article 5. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the marketing initiative without a thorough DPIA, relying solely on the assumption that existing data handling practices are sufficient. This fails to meet the legal obligation under Article 35 of the GDPR, which requires a DPIA for processing likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. Such a failure could lead to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and a breach of trust with clients. Another incorrect approach would be to implement the initiative based on a superficial review of data privacy policies, without engaging relevant legal and compliance teams. This overlooks the complexity of data processing and the potential for unintended consequences, such as inadequate consent mechanisms or insufficient data security measures. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the detailed requirements of data protection law. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed to market over robust data protection, assuming that minor adjustments can be made post-launch. This fundamentally misunderstands the by-design principle of data protection, which requires privacy considerations to be embedded from the outset. It exposes Pirelli to substantial legal and ethical risks, as regulatory scrutiny often focuses on the initial design and implementation of data processing activities. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying all relevant legal and regulatory obligations. This is followed by a risk assessment, where potential compliance gaps and their consequences are evaluated. The chosen course of action must then demonstrably address these risks in a manner that is compliant, ethical, and aligned with the company's values and strategic objectives. In data protection matters, this often necessitates a precautionary principle, prioritizing robust compliance measures even if they introduce minor delays. Question 14. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a regulatory compliance issue with the proposed new tire model's marketing materials, potentially conflicting with advertising standards set by the Advertising Standards Authority, ASA. Pirelli's marketing department is eager to launch the new model next quarter to capitalize on seasonal demand. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Delegate the responsibility of assessing the ASA compliance of the marketing materials to the sales team, as they have direct customer interaction. Option B. Launch the product with the current marketing materials and instruct the marketing team to make minor adjustments if any customer complaints arise regarding the advertising. Option C. Proceed with the launch as planned, but initiate an internal review of the marketing materials immediately after launch to address any potential issues. Option D. Halt the product launch until the marketing materials have been thoroughly reviewed by legal and compliance, and any identified discrepancies with ASA standards are fully rectified. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the launch as planned, but initiate an internal review of the marketing materials immediately after launch to address any potential issues. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a business objective, launching a new product line, and a potential regulatory breach identified through internal risk assessment. Pressure to meet market demands and achieve financial targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay identified risks. Careful judgment is required to balance commercial imperatives with the absolute necessity of regulatory compliance. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough investigation of the identified risk. This means halting the immediate launch plans until the compliance issue is fully understood and rectified. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governed by the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, mandate that firms must conduct their business with integrity, due skill and care, and in a manner that promotes competition and treats customers fairly. Launching a product line with a known unaddressed regulatory risk would violate these principles, potentially leading to significant fines, reputational damage, and harm to consumers. The correct approach prioritizes adherence to the spirit and letter of the law, ensuring that all products and services offered by Pirelli are compliant before they reach the market. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the launch while initiating a post-launch review. This demonstrates a disregard for the identified risk and a willingness to operate in a non-compliant manner, even if temporarily. This failure directly contravenes the FCA's principles for businesses, specifically Principle 3, Systems and Controls, which requires firms to have adequate systems and controls in place to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements. It also risks breaching Principle 6, Customers' Interests, and Principle 7, Communications with Clients. If the product, once launched, is found to be non-compliant and negatively impacts customers. Another incorrect approach is to seek to minimize the identified risk without a definitive resolution. This might involve relying on assumptions or interpretations that favor the launch, rather than seeking concrete evidence of compliance. This approach fails to uphold the duty of professional diligence and could lead to a situation where Pirelli is found to be in breach of regulations, even if the intention was not malicious. The regulatory expectation is for firms to actively manage and mitigate risks, not to simply hope they do not materialize. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to defer the decision to a later stage or to a different department without taking immediate ownership of the risk. This diffusion of responsibility can lead to paralysis and inaction, allowing the non-compliant situation to persist. Professionals are expected to take responsibility for identifying and addressing risks within their purview, escalating issues appropriately but not abdicating their duty to ensure compliance. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Acknowledging and documenting the identified risk. 2. Immediately pausing any actions that could exacerbate the risk, e.g., product launch. 3. Conducting a thorough investigation to understand the nature and extent of the regulatory concern. 4. Consulting with legal and compliance experts to determine the precise regulatory requirements. 5. Developing and implementing a remediation plan to address the compliance gap. 6. Obtaining confirmation of compliance before proceeding with the original business objective. Question 15. Regulatory review indicates that Pirelli is exploring new market entry strategies that involve analyzing competitor pricing and product development trends. To gain a competitive edge, the company is considering leveraging publicly available data, as well as data obtained through third-party market research firms. What is the most appropriate approach for Pirelli to ensure its actions are fully compliant with the relevant regulatory framework governing market conduct and data privacy? Option A. Proactively engage with the relevant regulatory bodies to seek formal clarification on the interpretation and application of data privacy and market conduct regulations concerning the proposed data acquisition and analysis methods. Option B. Rely exclusively on the internal legal department's assessment of the legality of data acquisition and analysis methods without seeking external regulatory confirmation or guidance. Option C. Immediately halt all market intelligence gathering activities that involve competitor data to avoid any potential regulatory scrutiny, regardless of the legality of such activities. Option D. Proceed with data collection and analysis based on a broad interpretation of publicly available information and industry norms, assuming such activities are permissible unless explicitly prohibited. The correct answer is A. Proactively engage with the relevant regulatory bodies to seek formal clarification on the interpretation and application of data privacy and market conduct regulations concerning the proposed data acquisition and analysis methods. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between a company's strategic objectives and the strict adherence to regulatory compliance, particularly concerning data privacy and market conduct. Pirelli, as a publicly listed entity, must navigate these complexities to maintain its reputation and avoid sanctions. The The challenge lies in balancing the desire for competitive intelligence with the legal and ethical obligations to protect sensitive information and ensure fair market practices. Careful judgment is required to identify and implement strategies that are both effective for business development and fully compliant with the specified regulatory framework. The correct approach involves a proactive and documented engagement with the relevant regulatory bodies to seek clarification and guidance on the interpretation and application of specific rules. This demonstrates a commitment to compliance and allows Pirelli to understand the boundaries of permissible actions. By seeking official clarification, Pirelli can ensure its data acquisition and analysis methods are aligned with regulatory expectations, thereby mitigating the risk of non-compliance. This approach fosters transparency and builds trust with regulators, which is crucial for long-term operational stability. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with data collection and analysis without seeking explicit regulatory clarification, assuming a broad interpretation of permissible activities, carries significant risks. This could lead to inadvertent breaches of data privacy laws or market abuse regulations, resulting in substantial fines, reputational damage, and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach, which is to cease all data-related activities that could be perceived as sensitive, even if potentially legal, would stifle innovation and competitive positioning, ultimately harming the company's strategic goals without a clear regulatory mandate to do so. A third incorrect approach, which is to rely solely on internal legal counsel's opinion without seeking external regulatory confirmation, might overlook nuances or evolving interpretations of the law, leaving Pirelli vulnerable to future challenges. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the regulatory landscape thoroughly. This involves identifying potential areas of conflict between business objectives and regulations, conducting thorough due diligence on proposed actions, and, where ambiguity exists, proactively engaging with the relevant regulatory authorities for clarification. Documenting all communications and decisions is essential for demonstrating good faith and compliance. Question 16. Consider a scenario where a client of Pirelli's financial advisory division, who is also a significant shareholder in a publicly listed company, requests advice on a proposed transaction that, if executed, could be interpreted as an attempt to artificially influence the share price of that company based on non-public information they possess. The advisor suspects this request, if fulfilled as described, might contravene the UK's market abuse regulation (MAR). What is the most appropriate course of action for the Pirelli advisor? Option A. Clearly explain to the client that the proposed transaction, as described, is likely to be in breach of the UK's market abuse regulation and outline the specific regulatory concerns, offering to explore alternative compliance strategies. Option B. Advise the client on how to structure the transaction in a way that minimizes the appearance of market abuse while still achieving their desired outcome. Option C. Immediately refuse the client's request and terminate the advisory relationship due to the potential regulatory breach. Option D. Proceed with advising the client on the transaction, assuming the client is acting in good faith and that the information is not strictly insider information, to maintain the client relationship. The correct answer is B. Advise the client on how to structure the transaction in a way that minimizes the appearance of market abuse while still achieving their desired outcome. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific outcome and the advisor's obligation to provide objective, compliant advice. The advisor must navigate the client's expectations while upholding regulatory integrity and ethical standards. The pressure to retain a valuable client can create a temptation to bend rules, making careful judgment and adherence to the regulatory framework paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves clearly communicating the regulatory limitations and explaining why the client's preferred strategy is not permissible. This demonstrates professional integrity and a commitment to compliance. Specifically, it requires the advisor to explain that the proposed action would violate the principles of fair dealing and market integrity, as it could be construed as market manipulation or insider dealing, depending on the specifics of the information and action. Adherence to the FCA's principles for businesses, particularly Principle 1, Integrity, Principle 2, Skill, Care and Diligence, and Principle 3, Customers' Interests, is essential. The advisor must act honestly and with integrity, exercise skill, care, and diligence, and treat customers fairly. Providing clear, factual information about regulatory boundaries is a direct manifestation of these principles. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that attempts to subtly circumvent the regulations by framing the prohibited action in different terms, without outright refusal, fails to uphold the principle of integrity. This could lead to the client misunderstanding the risks or believing they are acting within the rules when they are not. Such an approach risks facilitating a breach of regulations, potentially exposing both the client and the firm to significant penalties. Another incorrect approach would be to simply refuse the client's request without providing a clear, regulatory-based explanation. While it avoids direct noncompliance, it fails to educate the client and may damage the professional relationship unnecessarily. A more constructive approach, which involves explaining the regulatory rationale, is preferred for fostering trust and ensuring future compliance. Finally, an approach that prioritizes client retention over regulatory compliance by agreeing to the client's request, even with reservations, is a severe ethical and regulatory failure. This directly contravenes the FCA's principles and could lead to serious disciplinary action, reputational damage, and legal consequences for all parties involved. Professional reasoning. Professionals in regulated environments must adopt a framework that prioritizes compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the relevant regulatory framework, e.g., FCA Handbook in the UK. 2. Identifying potential conflicts between client requests and regulatory obligations. 3. Clearly and transparently communicating regulatory constraints to clients, explaining the rationale behind them. 4. Offering compliant alternatives where possible. 5. Documenting all advice and client interactions. 6. Escalating complex or high-risk situations to senior management or compliance departments when necessary. The ultimate goal is to act in the best interests of both the client and the integrity of the financial markets within the bounds of the law. Question 17. Benchmark analysis indicates that Pirelli's recent acquisition of a UK-based financial services firm presents a significant opportunity for market expansion. However, the integration process must meticulously adhere to the UK's regulatory framework, particularly the Financial Conduct Authority's (FCA) rules on consumer protection and anti-money laundering. Considering the potential for disparate compliance standards between the two entities, which of the following approaches best ensures Pirelli's regulatory adherence post-acquisition? Option A. Proceed with the full operational integration of the acquired firm, assuming its existing compliance procedures are sufficient, and address any identified regulatory gaps on an ad hoc basis as they arise. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive regulatory compliance audit of the acquired firm's operations, systems, and policies against FCA requirements, followed by the development and implementation of a targeted remediation plan before full operational integration. Option C. Delegate the responsibility for ensuring regulatory compliance of the acquired firm solely to the acquired firm's existing compliance department, without establishing an independent oversight mechanism from Pirelli's central compliance function. Option D. Prioritize the integration of IT systems and customer databases, deferring detailed regulatory compliance reviews until after the initial operational merger is complete. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive regulatory compliance audit of the acquired firm's operations, systems, and policies against FCA requirements, followed by the development and implementation of a targeted remediation plan for full operational integration. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Pirelli's compliance team due to the inherent tension between business objectives and regulatory adherence. The need to quickly integrate a new acquisition while ensuring all operations comply with the UK's stringent financial services regulations, specifically those overseen by the Financial Conduct Authority (FCA), requires meticulous planning and execution. Failure to do so could result in significant fines, reputational damage, and operational disruption. The core challenge lies in identifying and rectifying potential compliance gaps within the acquired entity's existing processes, without hindering the integration timeline. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive due diligence process focused on regulatory compliance. This entails conducting a thorough review of the acquired company's policies, procedures, and systems against FCA requirements, identifying any discrepancies, and developing a clear remediation plan. This approach is ethically sound and regulatorily compliant because it prioritizes adherence to the law and protects both Pirelli and its customers from potential harm arising from non-compliance. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible business practices, which is a cornerstone of FCA expectations for regulated firms. An incorrect approach would be to assume that the acquired company's existing compliance framework is adequate without independent verification. This oversight could lead to the perpetuation of non-compliant practices, exposing Pirelli to regulatory sanctions. Another incorrect approach is to defer comprehensive compliance checks until after the integration is complete. This delay significantly increases the risk of undetected breaches and makes remediation more complex and costly, potentially signaling a disregard for regulatory obligations to the FCA. Finally, focusing solely on operational integration without a dedicated compliance workstream would be a critical failure, as it neglects the fundamental requirement to operate within the legal and regulatory boundaries of the UK financial services sector. Professionals should adopt a risk-based approach to compliance integration. This involves prioritizing areas of highest regulatory risk, conducting detailed assessments, and implementing robust controls. A clear communication channel between the integration team and the compliance department is essential, ensuring that regulatory considerations are embedded in every stage of the process. Regular reporting and escalation of identified issues to senior management are also crucial for effective oversight and timely decision-making. Question 18. The investigation demonstrates that Pirelli's internal audit team has identified a significant potential product defect that could impact future sales and require a substantial recall. The head of investor relations is aware of this finding and is considering how to manage its communication. Which of the following represents the most appropriate and compliant approach for Pirelli? Option A. Delay any announcement until the product defect is fully understood and a complete remediation plan is in place to avoid negative market reaction. Option B. Initiate a thorough internal review to verify the defect's severity and potential impact, and prepare a formal announcement for dissemination through official regulatory channels once confirmed. Option C. Immediately inform a select group of key institutional investors to manage their expectations and prevent panic selling. Option D. Share the preliminary findings on a private company forum, frequented by industry analysts to gauge their reaction and refine the message. The correct answer is C. Immediately inform a select group of key institutional investors to manage their expectations and prevent panic selling. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Pirelli, as a publicly listed company, must navigate complex regulatory requirements concerning the disclosure of material information. The challenge lies in balancing the need for timely and accurate reporting with the potential for market manipulation or insider trading if information is leaked prematurely or selectively. Careful judgment is required to determine what constitutes material information and the appropriate channels and timing for its dissemination. The correct approach involves a structured internal review process to confirm the accuracy and completeness of the information, followed by a formal announcement through designated regulatory channels. This ensures that all market participants receive the information simultaneously, upholding principles of fairness and market integrity. Specifically, this aligns with the principles of market abuse regulations, which prohibit selective disclosure and insider dealing. By adhering to a formal disclosure process, Pirelli demonstrates its commitment to transparency and regulatory compliance, preventing any perception of unfair advantage for certain stakeholders. An incorrect approach of selectively informing a small group of key investors before a public announcement is ethically and regulatorily unsound. This constitutes selective disclosure, which can lead to insider trading allegations and market manipulation. It creates an uneven playing field, disadvantaging investors who do not receive the information early. Another incorrect approach, delaying the announcement indefinitely due to internal uncertainty, also poses risks. While thoroughness is important, prolonged delays can be interpreted as an attempt to manipulate market perception or can lead to significant reputational damage if the market discovers the information through other means. Furthermore, failing to disclose material information in a timely manner can violate listing rules and securities regulations. A third incorrect approach, disseminating the information through informal social media channels, is highly unprofessional and breaches all established disclosure protocols. This bypasses regulatory oversight and creates a chaotic information environment, increasing the risk of misinterpretation, rumors, and regulatory sanctions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance, ethical conduct, and market fairness. This involves establishing clear internal policies for information handling and disclosure, conducting thorough due diligence on any potentially material information, and consulting with legal and compliance departments to ensure adherence to all applicable regulations before any public announcement. The principle of simultaneous and equal access to material information should guide all disclosure decisions. Question 19. The analysis reveals that Pirelli is considering a significant acquisition that could substantially alter its market position. However, concerns have been raised internally regarding the potential for certain disclosures related to the acquisition's financial projection to be perceived as overly optimistic by regulatory bodies like the FCA, potentially contravening rules on misleading statements. Which approach best navigates this implementation challenge while adhering to the UK regulatory framework and ethical standards expected of a listed company? Option A. Halt the acquisition process immediately and abandon the strategic initiative due to the perceived regulatory risk, prioritizing absolute avoidance of any potential compliance issues. Option B. Proceed with the acquisition, making disclosures that highlight the most favorable potential outcomes while downplaying uncertainties, arguing that such projections are standard in competitive and environments. Option C. Seek to structure the acquisition in a way that minimizes public disclosure requirements, relying on private agreements with key stakeholders to expedite the process. Option D. Engage in detailed due diligence and consult with legal and compliance experts to ensure all disclosures are balanced, factually supported, and compliant with FCA rules on market conduct and misleading statements, even if this means presenting a more conservative outlook. Correct answer is B. Proceed with the acquisition, making disclosures that highlight the most favorable potential outcomes while downplaying uncertainties, arguing that such projections are standard in competitive and environments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's strategic growth objectives and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Pirelli, as a publicly listed entity, must navigate these competing pressures while upholding its legal and ethical obligations. The challenge lies in ensuring that any proposed strategic maneuver, such as a significant acquisition, is not only commercially viable, but also fully compliant with all applicable financial regulations, particularly those concerning disclosure, due diligence, and fair treatment of shareholders. Misjudging the regulatory landscape can lead to severe penalties, reputational damage, and legal repercussions. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough engagement with the relevant regulatory framework, specifically the UK Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, Handbook and relevant Companies Act provisions, to ensure full compliance throughout the acquisition process. This includes conducting comprehensive due diligence that satisfies regulatory scrutiny, ensuring timely and accurate disclosure of material information to the market and shareholders, and adhering to all procedural requirements for mergers and acquisitions. This approach is ethically sound and legally mandated, prioritizing transparency, fairness, and market stability, thereby safeguarding investor confidence and Pirelli's long-term sustainability. An incorrect approach of prioritizing speed and commercial advantage over regulatory compliance would constitute a significant ethical and legal failure. For instance, proceeding with an acquisition without adequate regulatory clearance or without disclosing all material information to shareholders would violate principles of fair dealing and market abuse, potentially leading to FCA sanctions, shareholder lawsuits, and a severe blow to Pirelli's reputation. Another incorrect approach, such as selectively disclosing information to certain stakeholders while withholding it from others, would breach the fundamental regulatory duty of equal treatment for all investors and undermine market confidence. Professionals in such situations should employ a structured decision-making process. This begins with a comprehensive understanding of the applicable regulatory environment. Next, they must identify potential conflicts between business objectives and regulatory requirements. The core of the decision-making process involves evaluating proposed actions against these regulations, seeking expert legal and compliance advice, and prioritizing adherence to the law and ethical standards above short-term gains. This ensures that strategic decisions are not only commercially sound, but also legally defensible and ethically responsible. Question 20. The evaluation methodology shows Pirelli is considering a new approach to assess candidate suitability, which involves collecting detailed personal and behavioral information beyond standard CV and interview data. Which of the following approaches best balances the need for comprehensive assessment with regulatory compliance and ethical data handling? Option A. Share all collected candidate data with external psychometric testing partners for deeper analysis, without informing candidates of this data transfer. Option B. Implement a broad data collection strategy, relying on the assumption that all collected data is implicitly necessary for a thorough assessment, regardless of direct job relevance. Option C. Gather extensive personal and behavioral data for broad candidate profiling, assuming it might offer future insights without explicit consent for each data point. Option D. Collect only essential information directly related to the job requirements and candidates' ability to perform the role, ensuring clear consent and secure storage. The correct answer is D. Collect only essential information directly related to the job requirements and candidates' ability to perform the role, ensuring clear consent and secure storage. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Pirelli's hiring assessment process by requiring candidates to navigate the ethical implications of data handling within a regulated environment. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for comprehensive candidate evaluation with the stringent data protection requirements mandated by relevant regulations. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to ensure that the methods employed are both effective for assessment and fully compliant with legal and ethical standards, preventing potential breaches and reputational damage. The correct approach involves a data minimization strategy that aligns with the principles of data protection. This means collecting only the information that is strictly necessary for the assessment of a candidate's suitability for the role at Pirelli, and ensuring that this data is processed and stored securely and transparently. This approach is justified by regulatory frameworks that emphasize the lawful and fair processing of personal data, the principle of data minimization, and the need for explicit consent or a legitimate interest for data collection and use. Adhering to these principles protects candidate privacy and avoids regulatory penalties. An incorrect approach that involves collecting extensive, non-essential personal details from candidates for profiling purposes, without clear justification or explicit consent, fails to uphold data protection principles. This could lead to regulatory breaches related to unlawful processing of personal data and a lack of transparency. Another incorrect approach, which involves sharing candidate data with third-party assessment providers without adequate contractual safeguards or candidate notification, violates data security and privacy obligations, potentially exposing Pirelli to significant legal liabilities and damaging trust. A third incorrect approach, failing to implement robust security measures for the collected candidate data, leaves it vulnerable to breaches, which is a direct contravention of data protection laws requiring appropriate technical and organizational measures to protect personal information. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying all applicable data protection regulations relevant to the jurisdiction where Pirelli operates and hires. 2. Conducting a thorough data protection impact assessment for any new hiring or assessment methodology. 3. Designing assessment processes with data minimization at their core, collecting only what is essential. 4. Ensuring clear and transparent communication with candidates about what data is collected, why, and how it will be used and stored. 5. Implementing robust security measures and obtaining necessary consents. 6. Regularly reviewing and updating processes to maintain compliance with evolving regulations.